Hello and welcome once again to the Pocono Liars Club Zoom conference. And I'm honored today to have Jonathan Maberry as a guest. Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, Michael, how you doing?
Not bad. Now let's talk about Jonathan. He has a very long bio because he's done so much. And he's obviously a New York Times bestselling author, 5-time Bram Stoker Award winner, 3-time Scribe Award winner, Inkpot Award winner.
Feel free to summarize.
I'll summarize. He's written many books, been very popular. He actually wrote a Netflix TV series, V Wars was his. He's working on other movie projects that he can't talk about right now. He's done lots of other books in every genre, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And most recently, his most recent book is called Kagan. Do you have a copy of that you can show? There we go, Kagan the Damned. And that's coming out in a couple of weeks, I guess, pretty soon.
May 10th.
May 10th. And he's going to be back here in Pennsylvania at the Doylestown bookstore. That's May
10.
Oh, it's on May 10. Okay.
The actual official launch.
Perfect. Then I plan on being there, and hopefully some of you can go there as well. And he'll have copies to sign and other books to sign as well. But we're going to get talking about fantasy now, because I think that's an interesting topic. And this is Jonathan's first fantasy book that he's written, not his first fantasy story, however.
No.
And certainly he's been a fantasy fan for a long time. Let's talk, Jonathan, by explaining what we mean by fantasy. There's different categories.
Yeah, there are quite a few, and they're vastly different. Most often, like a lot of the writers that I know write either urban fantasy or dark fantasy, which is often contemporary, set in our world, but with elements that are fantasy. The TV show Lucifer is an example of urban fantasy. Jim Butcher's Dresden Files is urban fantasy. There's a lot of that. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, urban fantasy. Then there's dark fantasy, which tends to be, it can be contemporary, doesn't have to be. But it tends to go be much grimmer than urban fantasy, and it isn't necessarily required that it take place in a city. It could be rural, could be anywhere, but it's not swords and dragons. Dark fantasy can be other things as well. Actually, the first season of True Detective bordered on that, because there were some fantasy elements sewn into the mystery of it, with references to Robert Chambers' King in Yellow and so on. But what I'm doing now was originally called, when I was a kid, we called it Swords and Sorcery. Conan the Barbarian was one of the very first swords and sorcery characters, though Lord Dunsany had done stories like that, epic adventures, even romantic fantasy, sometimes it was called. But swords and sorcery was what it was called for a long time. And that's when the genre as we know it was really born. And as that was the 20s and 30s. And since then, there have been tons and tons of folks who have written in that genre. And because of the way Tolkien approached that kind of fantasy, it wasn't as gritty as Conan. So they started referring to that as high fantasy. So it's less about the barbarian or the gutter fighter, and more about the clash of kingdoms. Something like Game of Thrones is right in the middle, has the grittiness of Conan, but it also has the elegance and complex political storytelling that you have in high fantasy. Epic fantasy is a term that kind of is an umbrella term for all of whether it's swords and sorcery of the old style, high fantasy of the Tolkien-esque style, or grimdark, which is another variation of it, which is best described as nihilistic swords and sorcery. Things do not end well for anyone. There are very few relatable and likable characters, and basically it all ends in tears. I personally view it as swords and sorcery, but for the sake of this conversation and the sake of business, I'm calling Kagan the Damned epic fantasy.
And is the difference between fantasy and science fiction or other stuff, is it because there's magic? Supernatural that doesn't have to be explained like a science would have to explain it?
Science fiction is based on science, and it should be, if not doable, but at least reasonable, based on scientific principles, even if we're going beyond that, like in Star Trek, creating faster than light travel and so on, which we know is not possible. But they give you the explanation of it creates a warp bubble in which things can move without the relativistic of impacts. Fantasy adds things in there that science can't explain, and that's where the bridge there would be Star Wars, the Force. I mean, I know they made an attempt to create a kind of a science fiction understanding of the Force with the midichlorians and all that, but that nobody liked it. Nobody remembers it. Nobody wants to continue that crap. It's science fantasy. And then there are different variations. There's sword and planet stories where you have fantasy elements, like John Carter of Mars. Somebody dies here on Earth, wakes up on another planet, and gets involved in all sorts of adventures, science fiction and fantasy-esque. Lots of subgenres of this, but epic fantasy is the zone that I'm currently writing in, and I've now done not only Kagan but its sequel, and I'm enjoying the hell out of it.
What did you, when you were growing up and you read the fantasy, who are the people that you really admire?
Well, I'll tilt my camera up here. If you can see right above me, that is a copy of Conan the Wanderer. Mm-hmm. That was the very first book I ever bought with my own money, 1967, I think it was, 66. I grew up, my first exposure to this was Conan. And I love those stories. They were reprinting the ones from the 30s, and then Sprague de Camp, Lynn Carter, and for one instance, Bjorn Nyborg added to the stories. And they also took a lot of Robert E. Howard's non-Conan stories and rewrote them as Conan stories to expand the genre so that there were more stories to tell. But around the same time, I also got into Michael Moorcock's fantasy, which he's been doing this Eternal Champion cycle of novels since the mid 60s, and has a new one coming out, new Elric coming out. It's all incarnations of the same hero throughout time and space.
Right.
And some of them are actually straight science fiction, like the Jerry Cornelius incarnation, and futuristic fantasy fiction, like the Jarek Carnelian fantasies. But you also have Elric and Coram and Von Beck and all these different avatars of that. I loved all of those books. You had Stephen Donaldson's stuff in I think it was the 80s, where you had an entirely unlikable hero.
Yes.
Thomas Covenant, the Unbelievable. Oh my God. Unbeliever. He is the least likable protagonist I've ever read. And the only reason he's the hero is because he's wearing a white gold ring, and in that fantasy world, that's the most powerful metal. It's like,
but at the time when that came out, there was very few. I mean, I was growing up at that time, and I read all those books when they came out because there was just not that much fantasy out there at the time.
No, it had faded a bit, and that series of books did a great deal to help bring it back. The other person who was writing around that time was Carl Edward Wagner, who had a series of stories about a character named Cain. The actual Cain is in Cain and Abel, who is cursed to live forever. And he's actually a bad guy. He is a sorcerer, murderer, thief, conqueror, but also marginally less vile than the other villains. And so it's a real narrow gap. And sometimes he's the actual villain of the story, and sometimes he's the anti-hero of the story. Loved those stories, very dark, owed a lot both to Conan, but also to Lovecraft, but a lot of Lovecraftian elements in it. And I think it's, if I had to pick one of these sources to be my strongest inspiration for Kagan, it would be the Cain stories, even though Kagan is not a vile bastard like Cain is.
Yeah. What about the Lovecraftian mythos? How do you categorize those?
Well, that's its own genre. It's called cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is actually a genre of science fiction because the Lovecraftian stories are not supernatural. They're science fiction. It's a race of beings that have come to Earth that are so vastly powerful that they're indistinguishable from gods. And their presence can corrupt and change, human thoughts, human genetics. Lovecraft created this in the 20s and 30s, and then opened it up and allowed anyone he wanted to use his characters and tropes and so on, and everyone has.
Well, that's you know where I'm going with this then.
Yeah.
You're putting that into a fantasy story. Does that change it from being does that
change? No, because it's not the only weird part of the story. There's actual magic in Kagan as well.
Right.
But one of the things I do with Kagan the Damned is there are three principal religions that play out in this book. One is a harvest religion. They're the good guys at the beginning of the story, mm-hmm. and they're the official religion of this empire, Silver Empire. And it's not a spoiler to say the Silver Empire is conquered. It's conquered pretty much in the first page.
Right.
And their religion is pushed out and suppressed. The other two religions, one is the religion of Hastur, the shepherd god.
Mhm.
And if you ever read Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow, it's the same character. And there are older Hastors in various religions around the world. In this particular story, the villains of the piece, the Hakians, their religion was based on magic. And when the Silver Empire rose, it suppressed their religion to the point that it was violently and brutally suppressed. The Silver Empire thought they had good reasons for it, but generally when you try to squash out something so aggressively that is part of someone's belief system, the only thing you really accomplish is driving it underground. So the bad guys, headed by the Witch King, is my villain, believe that their religion requires, freedom of expression, and that means pushing back against their oppressors. So they have an argument. The third religion, and it's one from an island nation, is the religion of Cthulhu, and Cthulhu is the half brother of Hastur, and he's most often seen as a monster in the Lovecraftian stories. But then again, anybody's god or interpretation of a god that they believe in is going to be antithetical to what their enemy believes in.
Mhm.
And, so in their particular culture, they worship Cthulhu, and he's not a bad guy to them.
Right.
He is the enemy of Hastur, however, his brother. So there's a bit of conflict brewing there that we will see unfold in successive books as well.
For those listening to, I have read the book. I went right through it very quickly, not realizing it was his longest book. It is a fast-moving action adventure. I don't want to give any more spoilers, but obviously there are some Cthulhu mythos in there, which kind of threw me as a loop when I was first reading it. And I went, oh, well, that's interesting. I just didn't expect it, I guess.
Yeah,
I don't think it's much of a spoiler here, but
Yeah, the only other person I know that has used, that I know, I'm sure maybe others have, that has used Cthulhu and Lovecraftian cosmic horror was Karl Edward Wagner, because his stories also had similar monsters to them. And also, actually, in the Conan stories, Robert E. Howard was friends with Lovecraft and deliberately added Lovecraftian elements, sometimes even the same gods. They're not Cthulhu in his stories, and that made it kind of fun when I was growing up, because it was the first time, I don't know why this had never occurred to me, that writers would be friends of each other. To me, writers were their own entities that just existed out in the, they were all in cabins in the woods writing when I was in my head as a kid.
Let me ask you a little bit about world building and creating a fantasy story and having to keep it realistic while allowing for magic. You have to take into consideration a lot of things. When you were building this world, what kind of advice would you give someone else who wanted to do a fantasy novel based on what you did?
Well, my approach to doing any kind of world building is think about day in the life. Don't think about the big picture stuff. Think about day in the life. Follow, whether this makes it into the book or not, follow somebody through a day and all the things that they would encounter in the day. They would encounter their home rituals, maybe something tied to their religion, the way in which their family and community is set up, because you encounter bits and pieces of that in your daily life anyway. The economy, like if he's gonna buy a chicken, what's it gonna pay for pay with to buy the chicken? What kind of jobs are there for people? Once you start seeing the day-to-day life, it gives you a sense of both community and culture. And as you dive deeper into the culture, you start bringing in elements from real world cultures and kind of create versions of that for your fantasy world. Very few, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen a fantasy world where there is no corollary to our real world, whether present day or history. Game of Thrones is basically medieval Europe, so that allows us common ground when building a structure that the readers will understand. You don't want to make it so exotic that there's no connection to something you're aware of. So, people have swords, people ride horses, people eat bread, little things like that. And then you go up the scale into more and more bizarre things. Eventually, you're going to get to the point where you're going to need to build the religions and the politics. Religion and politics have played a part in every culture ever. I did not build the religions or the politics of Kagan to be connected to anything that's going on in our world. Our world is enough of a dark fantasy story, and I think it's closer to grim dark than high fantasy. Just saying. But I do, I'm somewhat of a student of history, so I do base it on elements of cultures and religions from around the world and throughout history. There's a bit of almost Native American viewpoint of nature in the harvest gods, and the way they do things, because the father figure is the sower and the mother figure is the reaper, and their children are various aspects of that kind of agrarian cosmology.
Well, their followers are called gardeners, and
well, the clerics, the priests are called gardeners, and the churches are called gardens. So that that everything ties into that. It's also known as the green religion for that reason.
And when you're doing this and you're trying to make a book that is relatable to a current population, you want to make it realistically, historically in some ways. And I'm thinking of, for example, how women and men are treated differently, because you don't want to make it, go ahead.
Well, yeah, and that's a curious thing, because in most cultures throughout history, unfortunately, it's been patriarchal. And even when it's a matriarch running it, the way in which the average woman is treated is still that patriarchal misogyny that men are stronger, therefore they should have more power. Women are physically weaker, therefore they should have less. And I'm tired of seeing that. So in our story, since one of the mother and father gods are equal, and the empire has empresses, it's always been run by empresses, I wanted it to be a little more equitable in terms of how gender is regarded. Not that I'm trying to write, as one person suggested, a woke novel. I'm not. I'm writing a novel about a culture where that particular bit of flawed human behavior, the violent misogyny, is not a factor. It's not. There are punishments for crimes against women, just as there are punishments for crimes against any other person. And then we see what happens when the protection of that religion crumbles, and you have an invading force, what they're doing, and how rape is often used as a weapon to not only demoralize women, but to demoralize a culture. And sadly, we've seen that so many times. If you've read any historical work on a siege city, like I read a number of novels set during the Peninsular War, Napoleon versus oh god, I'm blanking on his name, the British guy, that battle in Spain and Portugal, when no matter who was conquering a city, whether it was the Britons, the British, who were supposed to be the good guys, or the French, when they finally got into that Wellington, thank you, when they finally broke into the city, there was always rape and murder, always, no matter. And sometimes, even if there was even if rape was punishable by death, that was suspended for the first 24 to 48 hours, because you couldn't stop your own men. Officers would be killed trying to stop their own men. So you see some of that here, but there's also a bit of a deliberate use of it to crush the religion of the garden.
Let's talk a little about magic when you're creating a fantasy world. One of the problems I've seen in some fantasy stories is that the magic is, you pull it out of a hat when you need it. There are no rules, and oh no, how is our hero going to survive? Aha, he uses a spell we've never heard of before.
Right.
And obviously you don't want to do that, and you didn't do that. How did you create your magic system? Do you have your rules all written down somewhere on the side?
I kind of do, but some of it's also in my head, and some of it's based on the way magic's been presented in folklore, and quite a lot in pre-Raphaelite poetry, which is a big influence on some of my characters. There are different kinds of magic, and by the way, I should have back up and say that my grandmother was a wonderfully creepy old lady who taught me all about what she called the larger world when I was a little kid. She believed in everything: ghosts, werewolves, vampires, the whole bit, and taught me a lot about the folklore and even the anthropology of magic and supernatural beliefs, because they were really part of her world. And so when I was creating Kagan, magic had been completely repressed for 1,000 years, except that there are some things that lingered in this world, but were kind of isolated. There's a character who is based both on Tennyson's Lady of Shalott and Keats' La Belle Dame sans Merci. So it's a blend of those two characters, and also the Spencer's the Fairy Queen. She's the daughter of the Fairy Queen. So that character embodies elements of all three of those, and she's been isolated in a tower for all this time, but her magic is there, and she can't leave the tower. Now, the Witch King has brought magic back, and there's a certain way in which magic is powered in my universe, and that is a spoiler, so I'm not going to explain that. And he has managed to bring it back, and it's just starting to unfold. He can't control how it's coming back. In order for him to use it, he has to allow for it to be there. And so we see little isolated moments where you see, like in the second story, it's a spoiler for the second book, people won't remember by that point, but there's one little vignette in the second book where a little girl ghost who has haunted a painting is now wandering the house, but the house is deserted and everyone is gone, everyone's dead. From the painting, she only saw the echoes of her family that were there, but they've been dead for hundreds of years. And now she's lost, she's a ghost lost in that house alone forever. It's a terrible, tragic little scene, but she doesn't know how to be a ghost. She knows she's a ghost, but doesn't know what that means. And we see other things, like we see old ruins that are starting to awaken, that the magic that has been quiet for all these centuries is now coming back, and you have ghosts and you have other creatures coming out. There's a vampire that's referenced. Yep. In the second book, there are werewolves and so on.
And a dragon hidden somewhere back there.
And a dragon.
Just hinted at in the first book, I should say.
Yes. Actually, we don't meet the dragon until the third book.
Okay. In any event, you don't have like traditional cliched sorcerers casting lightning bolts or anything like that in your books, and that's not really what you were trying for, though.
No, and based on what I've read about the belief in magic, using magic has a physical cost to you as well. So, if somebody creates a hugely great spell, they are tired for a while. One of the films that got that right was Excalibur. Mm-hmm. When Merlin did a spell, he was weak afterwards, and it took him a long time to recover from it. Well, my villain does too. He does something incredible in this first night, but it's not like he can do that every day. Otherwise, he would be basically a dark version of Superman, and we'd all be screwed. So he has that power. It's just you don't know when he's getting his power back, how much he currently still has, and so on. And that makes it fun. It also makes the characters more vulnerable and more relatable, because just like a warrior, if a warrior fights a great battle, he's going to be tired for days. A horse who wins a great race is going to take a couple of days before they can race again, and that allows for the movement of characters and the advancement of plot lines, pro and con, to unfold while kind of the batteries are recharging.
And I agree completely, because I see too many fantasy stories that don't take that into consideration. Too many, and even some very, very popular, especially young adult novels, where whenever they have a problem, well, they're just going to have magic solve it, and that's an easy way out. It is,
and it's a bit Deus Ex Machina, which I don't like. There's a character, it's funny, he's going to be in the third book, named Alla Baxter, who part of the scholarly side of the Green religion. Even though they repressed magic, they wanted to keep alive the traditions of magic that were originally used in more positive ways. So they practiced the rituals, though nothing, since magic doesn't exist anymore, nothing happens. Well, in the third book, somebody practicing those rituals, suddenly magic starts to happen. And now these people who are basically temple priests who only go through the motions suddenly have power with no idea how to use it. And that's going to be fun to explore in a future book.
Absolutely. Let's talk about someone who wants to write fantasy, and let's talk about the market. Is that something that is still sellable, or do people want it to categorize much more closely? What does the market hold for us these days?
Well, right now, epic fantasy is hot. It's gotten big. I mean, between people like Robin Hobb and Patrick Rothfuss and Joe Abercrombie, George R. R. Martin, and so on. Fantasy's come back in a big way. It's big ticket. The Witcher series is huge. Game of Thrones is huge. They're doing the Lord of the Rings films, I think, probably kicked a lot of that off, that whole process. People are really into epic fantasy. The way I got into it is indicative of what's going on. So at Macmillan, one of the big publishing houses, it has several, most big houses have multiple imprints. And two imprints in particular of Macmillan, Tor and St. Martin's Griffin, have always been kind of friendly rivals, sometimes not so friendly. Tor is the bigger of the two imprints and has a pretty substantial footprint in science fiction and fantasy. And they've been doing a lot with fantasy authors. And at one of the meetings, the publisher of the St. Martin's Griffin line was having a meeting with her editors and marketing people. And they said, we want to increase our market share by getting a stronger foothold in fantasy. And she said to her editors, do any of you know any of your writers who are either writing epic fantasy, have a trunk book, trunk novel somewhere, or could write one? And everyone looked at Michael Hermler, my editor, who said, well, Maberry. Now, the reason to explain this, I am not saying I'm the greatest writer of all time, because clearly that's not true. But if you remember the old Life cereal commercials, the kid, give it to Mikey, he'll eat anything. Yeah. I'm kind of that way with fiction. People have come at me with the weirdest things, and if it sounds fun, I'm going to give it a try. And Homler, who's been a good friend of mine, and we've done a lot of books, all the Joe Ledger books and everything else, he called me up. I was actually just finished having breakfast and doing some writing at a restaurant here in San Diego. He calls me up and said, hey, he explained the meeting and said, do you have any interest in epic fantasy? And I explained, what I used to read and Conan and Canelet. He said, well, any interest in writing epic fantasy? And I said, well, they're pretty long books. And he said, yeah, but, what do you think? And I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. He said, well, hit me with a pitch, because we're having another meeting this afternoon and we're having another meeting on Monday. This was a Thursday. He said, just this afternoon, I'll tell them that you're interested. Monday, hopefully you'll have a pitch for me. I had a pitch for him in 20 minutes. It just, that idea just popped in my head. So that afternoon, he took it to the meeting, and within 2 hours of that phone call, we had a 2-book deal in place, because they really want to get rolling on this. And they know I can write fast too. Little side note here. Not everyone writes fast. I have some friends who write as fast or even faster than I do. And I have friends who write a book every 3 years. So it's not a competition to write fast. It's just that if you know that you can, it just makes it a little easier for an editor to ask you to try something. And so that Kagan, which is 176,000 words, I wrote in a little over 3 months from that meeting, because I actually was just wrapping a book, so I was able to jump in it right away. And I wrote the second book. It would have been 4 months, 207,000 words, but then I got COVID in the middle of it, so it became 5 months. But the actual writing time was a little under 4 months.
And it's a character, I should mention, the character was actually, this is the blocking is there. We have a book that you and I edited together called Baker Street Irregulars, which is a series of alternate Sherlock Holmes stories. And you have a story in there about Motherfrey, who is a character that you decided to use. Now, when you wrote that story, had you in mind that you were going to maybe expand it later?
No, when I wrote Hammer of God, I had the character of Motherfrey and her assistant, Miri, in my head for years, but I never quite found the right market for it. I knew it was going to be a longer, like a novelette rather than novel, but I just didn't have the right market for it. And when we start doing the Baker Street Irregular book, last thing I thought, originally was that I was going to write an epic fantasy story, but I sat down to write it, and I thought it'd be kind of fun. An investigator for the Office of Miracles, who goes investigating what appear to be miraculous events, and just like in Sherlock Holmes, where something will appear to be supernatural and turn out not to be, this had that same conceit. And I had a lot of fun writing it. Loved the characters, but for me it was a one and done. And I had written another epic fantasy short story called The Damned 100 for an anthology called Operation Arcana, edited by John Joseph Adams. And that's also set in the same world. But again, I didn't really plan to do much with it. Sometimes writers have either a character or a world that they'll, in need, they'll just set it there because it gives you a convenient location. It's kind of like Stephen King with his town of Derry or Castle Rock, my town of Pine Deep. You know, you can go back there, you're familiar with the landscape, you can dive right into the story without having to do as much original world building. But then when I started to do Kagan, I'm thinking, well, I know what the basic idea is. I need an antagonist for the Witch King who is an antagonist on a different level than Kagan. Kagan's a fighter. So I wanted a very manipulative political character. And Motherfrey was perfect for it. So I brought her into the story, and she's now a regular. And the character of Miri, who was her assistant, who by the time of Kagan is no longer her assistant. She's out doing something else. And I gave her a much more complicated backstory than I had alluded to in the first. And just had a bunch of fun with that. Motherfrey is one of my favorite characters I've ever created. I love that character.
And
I would hang with her.
Oh, you've tied a lot of your other books together, although it wasn't originally planned that. I mean, Joe Ledger had shown up in the Rust and Ruin,
Rotten Ruin,
Night,
V Wars. He's shown up a lot of things.
Yeah. So you've tied it all together. Can you tell us, is there any news? I know this is kind of off the topic. We're supposed to be talking about fantasy. Is there any news of any TV or movie options that you can mention at this point?
Some things I could mention without too much detail. The biggest thing, the most exciting thing is Rotten Ruin is with Alcon Entertainment, the people who did the Expanse TV show, Book of Eli, Blade Runner 2049. They optioned a few years ago. They are on the fourth draft of a script right now, and things are looking pretty good. You know, they want to do a series of feature films, and the CEO and the vice president are huge fans of the books, and we talk all the time on the phone. We go out to lunch a lot, so I'm knocking wood, but I'm pretty enthusiastic about that, optimistic about it. Then I have Joe Ledger is being looked at by a film company I cannot name, and an actor I cannot name who's having a pretty spectacular comeback recently. And that's pretty interesting. Mars One, my standalone Mars novel about people moving to Mars, has just been optioned.
Well, that's a young adult type of story, right?
It's young adult science fiction, but the person optioning it is looking to do an all ages television show, you know, of the book, but also a reality show about the actors playing those characters and what they think about Mars. So that's kind of that plan. And then I had recently had a collection of zombie short stories published, and two of the short stories from that have been optioned for film. Fat Girl with a Knife, which is about a body positive girl who's being bullied because of her weight. Turns out when the zombie apocalypse happens, she happens to be the one tough enough to save everyone, even the bullies. And that's in development. And development does not mean production. Development means they're looking to see if they can make something happen as a possible TV movie. And then the other thing is Death Poem of Sensei Toro, which is set in feudal Japan. An old aging samurai is hired to go rescue an important child from an island that's overrun by zombies. And one of the actors, very, very familiar actor who was in Last Samurai and Endgame, Avengers Endgame and other things, is part of a team that just optioned that for possible film. And there's a couple other projects too. There's a lot of stuff floating around right now.
That's wonderful. Let me go back then, because I just had to ask that while I was thinking about it. But we were discussing the marketability, and you say high fantasy is very big right now. Is it better if you're starting out to write high fantasy to try to sell short stories first, or to actually go and try to do the big, huge, gigantic book that they're looking for?
A bit of both, actually. While you're writing the novel, I would definitely try to sell short stories. Unfortunately, there is not a big market for fantasy short stories. Anthologies, occasionally something like Lightspeed Magazine, which is an e-zine, they do fantasy, and Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction does fantasy, but there aren't as many markets for short stories. That said, it does give you an opportunity to explore some elements of the world, get it out there, at least get it in editors' eyes, let them see it while you're writing the novel. And for most people, especially when you're starting out, a novel of that size could take years. Understand, Kagan was my 43rd novel, and the sequel was my 45th novel. So I'm not new to writing novels. Therefore, I can jump in and get it going a little faster. If I had had that same offer back when I was starting, it would have taken me probably a year and a half or better to write it.
And boy, I just lost my train of thought. I had a question for you, and now I lost it. Oh yeah, Weird Tales. Are you taking any science fiction, fantasy stories? Tell us about Weird Tales first of all. And
okay, so Weird Tales, 99-year-old magazine, the oldest horror magazine, and that's where H.P. Lovecraft got his start. Robert E. Howard got his start. Pretty much everyone got their start. Robert Heinlein published, in Weird Tales. Ray Bradbury published in Weird Tales. So it's back now. I'm editing the magazine. In fact, we had an issue come out yesterday, my third issue. We'll have 3 more this year come out, and then we'll settle down to a three a year thing. We published weird science fiction, weird fantasy, weird horror. Notice that weird shows up in all 3 of them, because if it would fit in your standard, say, science fiction magazine, it's not right for us. So for example, whereas Star Trek would not fit in our magazine, something like Alien would, because even though it's not supernatural, it's a horror story using science fiction. So that would actually work for us. Swords and sorcery fiction was largely born in the pages of Weird Tales. All the Conan and King Kull and all those stories were published there. Jirel of Joiru by C.L. Moore, the first female sword and sorcery character, published in Weird Tales, and so on. So we're definitely looking for epic fantasy, dark fantasy, grim dark, any variation of it for Weird Tales, for sure. But also other weird stuff.
Now, you grew up reading Moorcock and people like that, and now you're dealing with them. In fact, Moorcock gave you a quote for this new book, right?
Yes.
Who would you have liked to have met that you didn't, and who have you met that you have to brag about?
Well, I would love to have known Carl Edward Wagner, who did the Kane stories. He was one of my favorites. But of the people who are kind of in my lifetime that I wanted to meet, I've actually met a large number of them. And I know how weirdly fortunate I am that this happened. When I was a kid, I got to meet and be mentored by Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson, which was awesome, and got the last ever cover quotes from them before they passed. My editor, had reached out to them around the time the first book was coming out, but they didn't get the quotes in time. So that when the 10th anniversary came up, she said, "Hey, guess what? We still have these quotes. We haven't used them." I may have ugly cried when I saw those quotes. I became friends with Stan Lee, not like best buds, but close enough that we hung together and talked, and that was a lot of fun because I was writing for Marvel, and not that he wasn't with Marvel anymore, but still he co-created the Marvels we know it.
Oh yeah.
Became very close friends with George Romero, the guy who wrote and directed Night of the Living Dead.
You did a book with him.
We did an anthology with him that I'm currently shopping as a TV series, and weirdly, my partner in this, if you ever watch the show Psych, well, the star of that, James Roday, is a buddy of mine. He is a huge horror fan. So he and I are actually shopping a TV show version of that around right now. We've been doing Zoom pitches to Netflix, et cetera, et cetera. So I've gotten to meet a lot of my literary heroes. Michael Moorcock I haven't met yet, but what happened is my editor reached out to him and to ask if he might be willing to give a cover quote, even though he's notorious for not giving cover quotes, and even more notorious, infamous perhaps, for the fact that if he doesn't like a book, he will send a scathing letter about it. He sent it to, and he didn't tell me because if he got a bad letter, he didn't want to break my heart with it, because he knows what a Michael Moorcock fan I am. And then we got this great quote from Michael Moorcock. And I got a nice letter from him saying that he really loved the book. He was very pleased that I didn't fall into cliche traps and did not, how did he phrase it? I didn't write a cookie cutter epic fantasy, and I didn't try to be George R.R. Martin.
Yep. But
his quote was, if you're looking for something like George R.R. Martin, this will please you. He also called me a bastard because he didn't figure out who the villain was until he got there in the book.
Well, neither did I.
But also, Joe Abercrombie is one of my favorite fantasy writers. I haven't met him yet, though we've conversed through emails. And Robin Hobb, whose works I really love, and we actually got a cover quote from her. So
Excellent. And you, maybe I know that I'm sort of getting off topic here because we're supposed to talk about fantasy, but there's a couple of questions I wanted to ask you just in
Yeah.
general. You worked on the Black Panther comic book for a while.
Mhm.
What was your opinion of the movie?
I love the movie. My only connection to the movie is not much. The patterns on his costume are based on the alchemical symbols T'Challa painted on his skin when he was trying to reclaim his power during my run because he had lost his abilities as the Panther and his sister had taken over. I am hoping that the new movie, Wakanda Forever, will have some elements of my run in it because apparently the rumors are they're either going to have Dr. Doom in it or more likely Submariner, and they were the villains of my run. I wrote the Doom War run of Black Panther, and I did the first run when Shuri was the Panther, and Shuri's likely to be a main player in this new movie. So I like what they did. The fact that Chadwick Boseman did all of the Marvel movies while dying of cancer and none of his co-stars knew. Holy crap. I get a cold and I've got the worst man flu of all time. This guy's dying of cancer, buffs up, kicks ass in a whole bunch of movies, and then dies quietly with his family. And everybody's like, wait, what? He was the king.
Great. He was a perfect casting. I agree.
Oh my God. Never, ever going to be able to replace him.
All right. Well, we only have a little bit of time left. So let me ask you a couple of basic general questions about fantasy. And if they are a beginning writer, what kind of mistakes do you see beginning writers make when they're trying to write fantasy, or other advice you can give that I haven't asked you about yet?
Well, the most common mistake that people do when they're trying to write fantasy is they're trying to write like their favorite writer. They're trying to do another Tolkien, which means they're going to put elves and dwarves in there. Stop doing that. Never do that again. I mean, Terry Brooks did it with the Shannara books. Okay, and everybody else has copied it. Stop copying. Don't try to write a Game of Thrones. Don't try to write Conan. Don't try to write Wheel of Time. Find your own story and your own voice. Most importantly, your voice. Don't be afraid to be different from your favorite writers, because if you're copying, you're going to lost in the shuffle of all those people trying to copy. You're never going to get seen, and you're probably not going to get bought these days. But if you're writing with your own voice, and if you see a cliche, like you want to put a dragon in there, like I have a dragon in my story, don't do your standard dragon. Don't have somebody find an egg and then hatch the egg and it becomes their pet. No. It's been done 4 or 5 times. Don't do that. Don't have cardboard cutout characters. Aim for the gray area emotionally and psychologically. Build characters with all sorts of flaws. My character, Kagan, the very first sentence of the book, actually, I want to read you the entire first chapter.
The entire first chapter is one sentence. Yes, you do that a lot.
Yeah. The chapter 1 is Kagan Vale woke to the sound of his own damnation. That's chapter 1. Now, he's a mess from day one. He doesn't really get his act together completely until 3/4 of the way through the second book. He's a mess. And as a mess, he's also out there doing a lot of damage to the bad guys because everyone he knows has died. Everyone he really cares about has died, he thinks. And, I started by taking a character who was a civilized guy growing up in the palace, city boy, affluent family. And I took all that away from him and made him a complete drunken mess for a while. Who's trying to get his act together in order to do something worth reclaiming his soul for, because he's lost that. And the villain, the Witch King, has a lot of complexity to him. He is not a black and white villain. He makes a compelling argument for what he's doing. It may not be one you agree with, but it's one that it has validity to it. It even has historical validity to it. So he was fun.
At the end, he gives a speech and you're going, yeah, I agree with them.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, I can't agree with him. That's not right.
And the thing is, if he ever gets to the point, any of the books where he accomplishes his goal, there will actually be peace. So, it's one of those funny things where he's the villain, but what person who has ever conquered a nation and set up their own nation was not a villain in the process? And that, we tend to forgive, the Henry the Fifths and all those who, they're the guys we're rooting for, but they're also invading France. They're killing people in somebody else's country. So, I wanted to put that complexity. And when writers approach writing this, approach with complexity, read history, but read history from the point of view of somebody who, from the point of view of not becoming invested in the winner. Just read history and be objective about it. Also, one other quick thing: if you're going to write fantasy, read fantasy. A lot of people don't read the genre they want to write in.
Yeah, that's true. I guess what I was going to say is your comments about bad guys and villains applies not just to fantasy, of course. It applies to anything you're going to write.
And that's kind of the point with this is this is evergreen information for anything you're going to write. Writing epic fantasy, the best way to write epic fantasy is read a lot of fantasy and then think of how you do it yourself. But in terms of making it a good story, complex characters, if there are times we have to use a cliche setup, okay, fine. Find a way to twist it and make it your own. And don't try to put things in there for the sake of it's fantasy, like renaming everything. It doesn't have to be every new tree has its own name or rocket. My story is set 50,000 years from now on Earth. Nobody remembers in that world remembers us because we completely collapsed our barbarism and rose back up again. There's a natural, like an internal logic to the evolution of cultures. So we see some similarities, but, make it your own. And one big thing is if you're going to write epic fantasy, no matter how grim it gets, if you're not writing from a point of view of I'm having fun doing this, your readers will not have fun reading it. That's a big.
Yeah, I agree with you there. All right. Any last comments you want to make before we run out of time?
Well, if anyone's going to be in the area on May 10th, I'll be launching Kagan the Damned at Doylestown Bookshop, the place where I launched every book up to the point where I moved to California. Love that place. And I'll be doing I won't be doing a reading. I'll be doing a discussion and Q&A and then a signing. And then I'll be going to the Pen Writers Conference in Lancaster right after that. But do that. Also, if you're a writer out there and you're with the Liars Club, so you should be, if you go to my website, jonathanmaberry.com, and spell my last name correctly, there's no Y in the middle, M-A-B. There's a whole page on my website called Free Stuff for Writers. It's downloadable PDFs of novel formats, query letters, comic book scripts, how to write a synopsis, all that stuff. Grab what you need, share it with your writer friends. And, one little real good bit of advice is people will constantly try to talk you out of being a writer. It's too hard. You'll get rejected. There's no money, blah, blah, blah. Don't listen. Just be relentless and just do what your heart's telling you is the thing that speaks to your passion. Right from the point of view of fun and passion, you'll do great.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. We're going to be posting this very soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys. Thanks, Michael. Great questions.
Thank you.